I've been working with transformation and consciousness for about 20 years now. And in that time, I found very few people who've actually done any work in their sexuality. So they come to me and they go through this whole journey and they've done all kinds of things. But when it comes to their sexuality, they're still living in the dark ages. So the question that presented itself to me is, how do we move people from that point to a point where they're even slightly ready to work at the kind of depth that you're working with here, in terms of the work of the dakas and the dakinis. So I started talking to people about what is their understanding of Tantra. And I've come across a number of people and they say, well, you know, I went to a Tantra workshop once and I didn't have a clue what they were talking about. I didn't understand their language. So what I began to look at then is, how can we re-language ourselves in such a way as to allow us a deeper access to ourselves as sexual beings? The root of all of our suffering is identification. Who and what we identify ourselves to be. This is the root of the mind, and ultimately, in order to come into the liberation of who it is that we truly are, we have to dissolve the root identification of who it is that we are. So most approaches work with, well, who are you and who do you think you are? To access our sexuality, we have to work with the question in a slightly different way. And that question is, what are you and what do you think you are? So identification is rooted in what it is that is added to us as we emerge into life. So we emerge into life, and the first thing that is added to us is what? What's the first identification that is added to us? Is gender. It's a boy, it's a girl. If it's a boy, it's taken home and the main sort of motif in the bedroom is blue or whatever. If it's a girl, it's pink. I'm painting very broad strokes now. But what we really want to get is what happens in the conditioning process. So it's a boy, it's a girl. What then is attributed to it's a boy, it's a girl, is if it's a boy, it's masculine. If it's a girl, it's feminine. And there begins our schizophrenia. Because what then we are then encouraged to do is identify with the masculine or the feminine as what we are. What that encourages then is a suppression in our own being of all of those characteristics or traits of the nature of being human that have been attributed to the opposite gender. So that gets suppressed in ourselves. So now we have to seek our completion of ourselves. We have to seek completion or wholeness through other. But that aspect of ourselves, be it masculine or feminine, whatever has been identified as such, is suppressed and therefore projected. So what we end up seeking constantly is the suppressed or the repressed feminine of ourselves or the repressed masculine of ourselves. So what the work of TrueSex is about is saying, first of all, in the identification with one or the other as what we are, we find ourselves then moving into what I term submergence. So submergence is really just a form of unconsciousness, and we really submerged in identity. In that submergence in identity, there is then a repression of all that we have identified ourselves not to be. So to give you a sort of a more visceral sense of what it is that I'm relating to you, see, so you can get what I mean with submergence. Have you all experienced being underwater, holding your breath? You know, the game you play, see how long can I hold my breath? And you look up and you see the surface. And you hold your breath. And you hold your breath. And you hold your breath. What is it that builds in your awareness and in your sensation as you're under the water holding your breath? What do you become most aware of?
Need to breathe.
Before that, the need to breathe. Physically, what do you become aware of?
Your chest, it starts pulsing.
Starts pulsing. You begin to hear your heartbeat. You begin to feel the throb of your blood flowing through your veins, and you begin to actually hear your blood flowing through your body. So you become aware of what I call the pulse and the throb of life. And the more you're withholding or holding the breath, the greater that pulse begins to push. And then at some point, you simply can't hold anymore. And what for most people occurs, unless you're like, you're a diver or something like that, but take from when you're a little kid or whatever, what for most people occurs is you hold that breath and you kick and you go for the surface. And as you burst through the surface, what you do is let the breath out. And then just as you are taking in the breath, you're already falling back into the submergence, and you get all the water in your mouth. In the submergence of identification for most people, that one little experience of pulse is the entire experience of sex. About 11 minutes of bump and grind and squelch and squirt. And then back into the submergence and back into the holding on to our sense of ourselves. In what I term the unconsciousness of identification, we live in that submergence, and so we live in a sense of a separate sense of self because we identified. And so in that identification, we experience separateness from that which we have been encouraged to disown in ourselves. So whatever that may be. In this case, we're just looking at masculine and feminine. So the superficial self, or the identified self, or what I term the narcissistic self, is the self that exists and lives purely on its own sense of self, and everything exists around me. That narcissistic self is what we can refer to as the ego. And the greatest fear of the ego is the fear of its own non-existence. So what we all know, naturally through our natural intelligence, is in the moment of orgasm, we cease to exist. So most essentially what the ego does, and the narcissistic self does, is we refuse to allow the fullness of love's presence to express itself through us, and most specifically through our bodies. And that refusal is our deepest tension. And it shows up in our bodies through the suppression of our breath. So the fullness of our breath starts to close down, and we live then in that submergence where we're literally holding breath. We're holding on to this sense of I'm something or somebody, because that's what narcissistic self wants. It wants to be something or somebody. It doesn't want to be the nothing and the nobody of unbounded, open, deep presence.